come back to you again with the second part of the civil rights movement. This one's going to be a little longer than the last episode or last video because I kind of did a mismanaging of just where I wanted to end. I should have ended it a little later, but let's just hop into it, okay? So, if this will let me, there we go. So, um, we last left off with Brown versus the Board of Education and just the desegregation of schools. And so this now starts a movement of people um, desegregating their school systems and coming against the wall of racism of like, hey, we're not going to desegregate our schools. Why should we ever do that? And so this kind of brings on the famous Little Rock Nine. And so these are 9 black students who were being integrated into a white school after desegregation. And so the school board in Little Rock said, hey, we're going to integrate schools in 1957. And so these are going to be the first 9 students to attend an all white school. And so 8 of the 9 actually end up graduating from the high school that they actually integrate into. No, excuse me, integrate into because it's just such a big moment that they're like, okay, we're going to finish high school. And then they go off to college and kind of live their lives. But this is this big moment because of the wall that the state kind of put up against them. And so you have Governor Orville Faubus, probably saying that wrong, but it's okay. He supported segregation. He was very much involved with like, hey, let's have Jim Crow laws, let's have this, let's have that. And then he sent in the Arkansas National Guard to essentially block these black 9 students from getting into the school. Like it's like we are going to deny you education because I strongly support in segregation. And so because of this divided the city of Little Rock. So it's one of these huge little microcosms of this is the civil rights battleground here in Little Rock, Arkansas, where like Little Rock is about 4 hours, 5 hours away from here, from like the DFW area. So it's just like that's not that far away from us in the grand scheme of our country. And so an injunction um, was forced upon him to remove the guards, which an injunction is just essentially a word where it's like they filed something to order the governor to not have this power anymore to guard these students. So he was later had to remove it. And then Eisenhower had a different response. He was like, "Hey, like this is such an important time. I want these kids to be protected because these 9 kids had these 9 students had death threats on them because it's like, hey, like I don't want you to go to this school so much that I would kill you, which today is just a crazy thing to think about because it's like there's no one actively trying to kill people going to school, and it's a crazy thing to think about. And so the mayor of Little Rock asked Eisenhower for assistance, and so he deployed the 101st Airborne Division um, to like essentially escort these kids to school. And so later on, the National Guard replaced the 101st Airborne, and then the students were able to finish this first year. And just because they were escorted into school doesn't mean that's where the problems ended. Some of these faced severe bullying, severe racism within their classes from their classmates because their parents didn't agree with it. And so they kind of had that mindset of that. And that was kind of the end of the crisis. After the school year finished, it's like, okay, like nothing bad happened. This is school. This is not a bad thing. So Now we're moving on to the arrest of Rosa Parks. So this is something y'all are kind of familiar with, but this happened in Montgomery, Alabama, and in December of 1955, she was just wanting to ride home. She was tired, and she didn't give up her seat to a white man. And so that was what ultimately led to her arrest. And so this arrest was happening, and all of it happened like all of a sudden. So, um, and it violated the city ordinance of black people could sit anywhere on the bus, but if a white person came up and told them to move, they would have to go to the back of the bus or stand if the bus was crowded. So this was this like Jim Crow racist ordinance, and it ultimately gets this woman arrested because she did not want to give up her seat. And so we think of it as like really, but like back then, that's how crazy times were. And so this leads to MLK and the rest of the people in the NAACP and the other civil rights movements organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. And so it was already organized before her arrest, but this just kind of like gave the ammunition to the boycott. That it was like, okay, this is the driving force for change. And so Ed Nixon, he kind of was the person who planned it all with the help of many others. Um, and then this later created the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was like, how do we improve civil rights and all of that in Montgomery, which is a very highly populated black area of the South. And so this bus boycott was huge because a big portion of the bus riders were black people trying to get to work, trying to get from place to place. And so when you eliminate that group of people, it might create an economic strain. So they were non-violently protesting and boycotting the bus system by saying that, hey, we're not going to ride the bus until you change this city ordinance. And so eventually they had this go forward, and Martin Luther King was made president of the MIA, or the Montgomery Impoverished Association. And this was kind of the stepping stone for Martin Luther King to really push civil rights in not just Montgomery, but in the South. And so this is the bus that it happened on. Um, it's now at the Henry Ford Museum. And so during this time, black people walked, others carpooled, biked, hitchhiked, whatever they could to avoid taking the bus. And so black taxi cab drivers like were just like, hey, just hop on, 10-cent fare. So it's the same as the bus. So again, just ways to fight the system non-violently. And then even white people in the community stood up. It was not just a black only, it was like some white housewives who had black maids drove them to and from work. So that was just another way of stepping forward and doing the right thing to help push the change of this awful city ordinance. And so there was white resistance as well. And so some joined the white cities council, and they were like, hey, we hate what's going on. We don't want this change. We're going to resist it, and it's going to be really bad. So, what ends up happening is that Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, their homes are firebombed, and there are crosses burned in their yards. Just everything and anything to try to rattle their resolve to try to push to make this change go away. And so boycotters were physically attacked. And again, these boycotters are not doing anything except for living their normal lives. And so imagine if you're trying to go about your everyday life, and then you're just like, hey, I'm just not going to take the bus. And then out of nowhere, people start attacking you. that's the situation Montgomery was going through right now. And so, and even to the point where boycotters were being arrested. So this crazy time led to crazy things happening. And so this ends up like really like leading to this integration of the buses because the federal courts ruled that you can't segregate the buses just like schools. And so luckily, because of this, you see a whole lot of people catching attention because of this boycott. The federal government got involved because they saw it, and so the decision was appealed. So it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's like, no, get out of here. Like it's illegal to have. It's like it's unconstitutional to have segregated buses, just like the school system. And so the city ordinance soon like ended the segregation. Like they just dropped the city ordinance. And so this impact was that it was this huge victory. Like we can do this without resorting to violence. By us being nonviolent, we can see the fruits of our labor. Because if we're being nonviolent and the other side is, who are you going to be like? Who's going to take the side of people beating up innocent people trying to go to work? It's like very few and far in between. And so, and it like the biggest impact like directly to Montgomery is that the buses are no longer segregated. Rosa Parks is a hero, and Martin Luther King rose to national prominence because of this. Because when something like this was happening, the national news came in droves to see it and to like report on it. And so now we're going to switch over to Dr. Martin Luther King. He's one of the most influential Americans ever. Was a reverend, born in 29. He was in charge of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or if you see it in the PowerPoint, it's the SCLC, not the other acronym. So he is the youngest person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize in his efforts for civil rights. And he was a master speaker. He was very loquacious. He was someone that once he gets in front of people and he starts talking, that's when people start seeing the like, oh, this guy knows something, he cares, he is very influential because of just him using his voice. And then he was assassinated in April 1968 in Memphis, yeah, I think. And he does look at these two key figures, Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi. These are the seeds of his essential philosophy on nonviolence. So Henry David Thoreau wrote Civil Disobedience, and that was essentially a book that was written by Henry David Thoreau because he never paid his taxes, and he's like, okay, like, but I'm gonna write this book, Civil Disobedience, and if everyone doesn't pay their taxes, then they can't arrest all of us. And then eventually he gets arrested for like a day, and then someone pays his taxes, and he's like upset that he's released after a day. But he writes that, and it's a very influential book even today. This is a part of the transcendentalism in the 1800s, in the early mid 1800s, of writing just freedom of thought, freedom of thinking. And then you also have Gandhi, who protested the British government in like hunger marches and all this being important, um, and being an important guide to like stop the British rule and eventually get Indian independence. And so it was like no fighting back, even if you were attacked. You like straight up do not, like, if someone's beating you up, you don't fight back. You let them beat you up because in the end you're beat up. But everyone who saw this like you will see the fruits of your labor that way. And so this was explained in the letter from Birmingham jail because Martin Luther King does get arrested. Um, he was thrown in prison for just protesting and just being nonviolent, and so this leads to a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. He essentially says it's like I will go to jail over and over and over again for breaking these unjust laws. This is civil disobedience. This is non-violent disobedience. So, do these discussion questions. Obviously, just write them down. Answer them in Google Classroom. And now we're going to go to the murder of Emmett Till. So this is a really sad story. Emmett Till is is murdered because he's a black kid, and so this is in Money, Mississippi. Um, and essentially, he was accused of whistling at a white woman, which was against the law in a way in like the social realm. It wasn't actual illegal law, but it was just one of those things. He was beaten and then shot in the head, like, and this was one of the key events that showed how racism was alive and well in America. That it's like, hey, this kid probably did nothing, but because he was in the wrong part of town, he gets killed. And you see this in a lot of movies. Obviously, you see this kind of in Holes, and you also see this in To Kill a Mockingbird and just many, many other movies where they pull from real life events like Emmett Till and just people in general just like being in a racist area and being in a racist like society in the 1950s. This is happening, and so Emmett Till is just a sad tragedy that happened. And so the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Ralph Abernathy, is founded kind of short, like 2 years afterwards, to try to bring religion into this because the South is a very religious area. So if we can bring religion into this, maybe this can help spur on change. And so this included MLK as well. And so the SCLC was relied on black Southern pastors, essentially. Like MLK is a reverend, he does hold church services. And so in 1963, protest starts. Like they begin protesting in Birmingham, and then they start the March on Washington, where they essentially just go and like just fight for civil rights in Washington D.C. in the state's capital. It's like, hey, if we can bring this movement up north to the capital, we can see change. And so then there's the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so Ella Baker, he is in the let's get college students and young people involved. Let's not let just these older people do it. Let's have the young voice be involved. And he is involved with the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, the Freedom Summer, and even establishing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And we're going to get into that in the coming slides. So, um, then later, it changes after the death of Martin Luther King. They focus more on Black power, and again, we're going to talk about that later. So after MLK dies, they look for another prominent leader, and they kind of look at the people behind Black power as a good focal point. As, hey, we need to focus on like our heritage and everything about us and be representative in the Black community. And so part of it is the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so these are um, just students coming in and being denied service at lunch, and they just stay there taking up space, making sure it's like they're just in there being nonviolent, like Martin Luther King kind of taught. And this is just one of those times where you see that if you um, there, I'm trying to think of the movie. It's not coming to mind, but there's um, sit-ins where people dump milkshakes on their heads and just food just because like hey we want to get a react. They're essentially people who hate these sit-ins are resorting to bully tactics trying to get a reaction out of people who do these sit-ins. And so the Greenboro sit-in is a very popular one, and it eventually turned into hundreds joining in this protest. And it didn't just sit in at this one diner, but at like local businesses across America that had this segregated or like no blacks allowed or go to the back if you want food. Like you can see this in Remember the Titans, where they try to go get food and then they're denied service because they're black. And so this is just one of those crazy times where it's just like, yeah, just buying food, like just going to a restaurant was a political stance. And so this just happens across the country. And then we're going to move over to the freedom rides. Freedom rides were essentially like terminal buses like Greyhound and like all of these big national bus companies are being segregated as well, and they're just like this isn't right because again plane travel's not that great and people still rely on buses and trains and all that. And so we're trying to desegregate just terminals. And so the NCC, they're going to test if southern cities had complied with this desegregation. So riders are beaten. Um, Bus terminals are firebombed in Alabama. And so obviously they showed that races, like even though they were ordered to desegregate, they were not. They had all of these still racist practices because some people think it's like, well, the court can say their decision, but what's enforcing it? Who's going to enforce this? And so apparently, like there's still work to be done with just the buses in the South. And so finally, like federal injunctions came in. It's like, if you don't do this, we will press charges against you and bring the force of the federal government onto you. And then there's James Meredith and Ole Miss. And so this is a black young man trying to get into a university, just trying to get into a state university. So he tried to get into Ole Miss, and he essentially sued on the basis of I can't go to school. Like you are denying me this, even though I have the grades. And he successfully got into Ole Miss. And again, like the Little Rock Nine, he is escorted by U.S. Marshals. And so, because again, people wanted to kill this man just because he wanted to get a higher education. And it's like, how dare you try to go to a white university? And so he later graduates in 1963. So this is a big step for the country. Just as like, hey, like this black guy can go to a white university, get a degree, not get killed. And so it's a step forward. It's a small victory. And so um, this is a really hard time of the University of Alabama. So Governor George Wallace, he is one of like the all-time racists of the 1950s, 1960s. He essentially blocks integration of the University of Alabama. And so two um, two students named like last name Hood and Malone, they wanted admissions, and essentially Wallace made a thing saying it's like I'm gonna stand in front of the schoolhouse door and block them, like physically block them. I'm gonna go there, make this political statement, and block these two students from getting in. Um, and eventually like the Justice Department sent federal troops to force Wallace to move essentially, and eventually Wallace reneges on this and like kind of has to stand down because the federal government is overseeing the state government on this. And so in Birmingham, um, is known as the most segregated city in America. There is a black and white part of town. And so these protests are happening, and essentially what ends up happening is the police commissioner says, "Hey, these protests that are happening, I don't want them in my city." And so we're going to put the fire hoses, we're going to stick police dogs on them to stop these from happening. And so this is this huge moment that shows it's like, oh, in like in the worst town in America for segregation. It's like this is awful, and it's like you're seeing the horrible atrocities happening. And so this was televised. This was a very highly visible um, moment in American history. That's like when this police commissioner six like they sick dogs and they like hit just like young people and adults with fire hoses, which if you've ever seen a fire hose like go full blast, it's like it's gonna knock you down. And so, and essentially, like just some merchants relented on this and it was like allowed desegregation happen in the city. And then there's the murder of Medgar Evers, which is a very interesting case. So he is a field secretary. So he's kind of a guy for the NAACP who works in an area and tries to like help the area in Mississippi that he's kind of stationed at. He was shot outside his home, and the thing is, they knew who did it. They charged Beckwith, Brian Della Beckwith with murder, and they tried him twice and essentially ended up in a hung jury, which means, excuse me, that the jury could not come up with did Della Beckwith actually do this, and it just came to a no decision. And finally, he is tried in 1994. So, like, let's see, 50, or 70, 80. Yeah, 31 years later, finally, justice is served with the conviction of Medgar Evers. That it's like he did it, we have enough evidence, and we were able to throw him in jail and finally get justice in some way, shape, or form for um, the Evers family. And so, again, make sure you do these questions, um, write them out, make sure they're in a complete sentence, all that. JFK and civil rights. JFK, very interesting. He, after the Birmingham campaign, he finally acts. And he finally acts in 1963. So he is finally ready to jump in the foray of civil rights. And he does this mainly because he does not like the fact that in his first term he was worried that he wasn't going to get reelected again. if he took a stance on civil rights. And it took, sadly, until he won his second term that he's like, okay, now I'm going to jump in because I'm not worried about reelection. And sadly, politicians like to do that. And so this is just a speech. If you want to read through it, you can. I'm not going to read it to you because I know that's a little boring. But then let's talk about this march on Washington, where 250,000 people like were in the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, and so this was a thought by Philip Randolph in 1941 that it's like, hey, we should have a civil rights movement that goes to Washington. And the thing is, that's like very long before it actually happens because just World War II is going on, then Korea happens, and it just kind of gets pushed back and back and back. And so the Big Six organized this. This was like Martin Luther King and like all the different organizations, like the NAACP and all the other ones that I'm kind of dyslexia the organization acronym because that's what I would do. But it was to push the civil rights legislation and employment rights. And then also just let's just get a higher minimum wage as well, like while we're at it. So there was a march opposition with the Nation of Islam. And also JFK disapproved. And Malcolm X, again, one of the leaders in the Nation of Islam, called it a farce. That it's like this is just a publicity stunt. And so members of the Nation of Islam face suspension because it's like this is how much we don't want you to do this because we have our own way of doing this. This is not it. And so labor unions supported it because they thought it's like, okay, this is our chance to gain some credibility as well as like let's work for the common man, which encompasses white, black, Hispanic, everyone, not just white people. And so there's that. But the biggest labor union kind of remained neutral in all of this. And so the highlights of the march: 250,000 people show up. It was more of a celebration than a protest. That's like, hey, we're celebrating all of the achievements we had and just are going forward. And then a whole lot of celebrities came in. The I Have a Dream speech happened and all of this. And then, kind of in the aftermath of this, the 6th Street church bombing happens. There are still people today that are directly involved with it. Like Condoleezza Rice remembers this day very vividly. Growing up in Birmingham, and this just is awful. So, like, this is in the lifetime of my parents. In '63, they were born in '62, so this is still in the mindset of some people, and so Um, this church that was bombed was the site of many civil rights meetings. And then because of this, 4 girls are killed and many are wounded, and it's just awful. I think one of the girls was a good friend of Condoleezza Rice. And then the KKK, they kind of are identified as the people who did this. And um, the FBI kind of withheld evidence about this, and so it's a really weird case where it's one of those crazy situations where the FBI kind of messes things up and justice isn't fully served. And now I'm going to switch over to something a little better: the Civil Rights Act of '64. So this is after the assassination of JFK, and President Johnson really pushes this through. He gets a lot of Southern Democrats who are um, racist and all this to vote on this because LBJ was a high ranking profile senator. So he knew how Congress worked a whole lot better than JFK did. And so I think if Johnson was not president, this Civil Rights Act is not passed so fast. And so JFK introduces it, obviously, and then without LBJ, this doesn't get through Congress. And so this prohibits um, public um, public accommodations to anyone, and it ended unfair voting requirements like literacy tests and just like a poll tax, all of that, and it made enforcement of legislation easier. Like if you do not follow these rules, you're going to go to jail. And so then in '64, also there was the Freedom Summer. This was held by the COFO, and this was to help get black people to vote, register them to vote, because I think out of the total number of people eligible, like black people, to vote in Mississippi, only 2% of blacks were registered that were available to. And so they also set up voluntary schools to help you learn how to do this and all this. And 1,000 people enlist, and a lot of them randomly are northern white college students trying to go down to get black people to vote. And then because of this, you get three civil rights workers shown right here. They're killed by the Klan because they're like, we don't want black people to vote. We don't want our way of life to change. So we're going to do whatever is necessary. And um, they disappear in June and found in August. And then like they were like even justice wasn't even that great because they received these like lighter sentences. The trial was kind of like you could see it. It's like, oh, these guys aren't like they're obviously guilty, but they're not going to get a huge sentence. And even one of them, and I didn't put their names on it because I just didn't want to, but these people, one of them is not been convicted until 2005. And that just shows you how long it takes for justice to be served sometimes. And it's a sad thing that these three young men died just for voting. And so, just like the clip I showed you at the beginning of the year of the Free State of Jones, of where they are being denied the right to vote in the 1880s and the 1860s, even 100 years later, they are still getting this right to vote refused. And so this spurs on the Mississippi Freedom Democrat Party. And so this is black people and people who stand for civil rights who like what the Democrats are proposing, but they just don't like the whole racism thing. They make their own party. And so this is just very alternative to the segregationist party of the Democrats, the Dixiecrats. And so LBJ was worried that if he supported this, that he'd lose Southern support. And then Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the people who founded the party and also addressed the credentials committee at the Democratic National Convention in '64, saying, hey, we should have a right to sit at the table to help make the Democratic platform. And they failed to get their delegates seated, even though they won delegates. And so this brought this huge attention that black people are not being represented in the Democratic Party at all. And that, like, what should we do? And so LBJ is fighting within his own party to get this kind of situated. And so make sure, again, you do these discussion questions, explain them, do all that good stuff. And also, if you're looking at my PowerPoint, I do have notes in there. So look at those as well. That might help reveal an answer for you. And then there's the Selma marches. So there is the movie about it. I'm not a huge fan of it, just because it kind of overblows some stuff and it gets some of the history wrong. But like most history movies, that's the case. And so this is just a march from Selma to Montgomery, and this is just again voting rights. I want to vote. Let me vote. And the first one is known as Bloody Sunday, where people are gassed and beaten by the police, and again the fire hoses are busted out, and dogs are like being sicked on just helpless protesters. And then MLK held a second march that gets disbanded, and then the third march finally gets to Montgomery. And then the Voting Rights Act of 65, which again, this is what happens when these protests kind of get national coverage, that you see a whole bunch more voting rights get passed. And so this strengthens the 15th Amendment, which, if you remember, 15th Amendment is voting rights for black men. But it kind of gets sent to everyone now because of the 19th Amendment. And then it also gives federal oversight over certain precincts that don't have a good representation. So it's like, hey, is there voter suppression going on? And then it banned literacy tests as a qualifying vote, because it's like you should be able to vote even though you can't read. So, and this was a huge victory for civil rights, just that now black people can vote, and now we can see change at the ballot place. So we can get like George Wallace out of Alabama, and just like people like that. You can vote people out of office because now you have a better right to vote. And then this is kind of, I would say, the first LA riots type thing, but it happened in Watts. And so, again, in 65, a white police officer stops a black motorist and arrests everyone in the car. And eventually, a crowd assembles and throws rocks. And this ends in a riot, causing $35 million in damages. And so, this destroys the kind of the suburb of Watts in LA, and just kind of like how the LA riots in the 1990s happened, excuse me, because of everything, and it ended up like destroying a huge part of the nation. And then there is the Vietnam impact. So the Vietnam War happens in late 1960s, early 70s to mid 70s. And so Johnson is needing soldiers for this war, and so he lowers the draft standards, and this makes more black men eligible for the draft. And so a lot of social welfare programs abandoned to pay for the war and all this. So this ends up being a really bad thing for black people, where like only 11% of the army is black, yet they make up almost a quarter of the casualties. And so also it proves that there are very few officers of African American descent, and it just shows that it's like there are still problems in the army, even though Truman desegregated the army. There's still a long way to go. And so there's very few, but a prominent one is Colin Powell. He's a big Vietnam War officer that later becomes Secretary of State under George W. Bush's first term. And so he later like drops, but it's like he is a very prominent person. And then MLK and many others spoke out against the war. That why are we sending people over to Vietnam We don't even know where Vietnam is on the map, and it's a small island. Why are we worrying about that? And so this is just this colliding of the Cold War and civil rights, and so it doesn't cohesively work together. And then we get to Malcolm X. He is born Malcolm Little. He joins the Nation of Islam, changes it to Malcolm X. He's the second most powerful black person in the Nation of Islam after Elijah Muhammad, who is the leader of the Nation of Islam. He says a lot of controversial statements, one of them being by any means necessary. So he sometimes promotes violence in the group. And so um, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X worked together for a couple years, and then Malcolm X says, I want all of this to happen, and Elijah Muhammad doesn't want it to happen. And so he breaks with the Nation of Islam and converts to the Sunni Muslim. But I also forgot, Malcolm X is also the main reason why Cassius Clay joins the Nation of Islam and changes his name to Muhammad Ali, where we know Muhammad Ali from boxing, and he's a big proponent of protesting the Vietnam War, where he even loses his heavyweight title and also loses eligibility to box because he was considered a draft dodger, even though he was a part of the Nation of Islam. He was nonviolent. He didn't believe that like he should go like fight in Vietnam and all that, and so he gets banned from boxing. But Malcolm X, he breaks with the Nation of Islam, joins and converts to a Sunni Muslim or Sunni Islam. He changes his philosophy, and he sadly gets assassinated in '65. He gets shot with a shotgun in a music hall, I believe, giving a speech, and is pronounced dead. And so this kind of starts Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton to bring up the Black Power movement. And this is just a more militant philosophy. How are we going? Like, we need to fight back, and we need to look out for ourselves. We need to look at this and actually kind of advocated for almost a segregation type thing of racial separation, having black nationalism. And then they're like, hey, we don't want any violence, but violence in certain instances. So if you are being attacked, fight back and all that. So, and also it was like, this is important for us to have black people gain confidence in themselves without having white people assist them, because it's like, hey, we are a proud people, we want to do things on our own, we don't need your help, white community, let us do this on our own, this is black power. And then this leads to the Black Panthers, and so this is founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and a whole bunch of others. And this is kind of a reaction to Martin or to Malcolm X getting killed. And so this is like, hey, we are going to be an armed resistance against the black people. And so we are going to fight in any way, shape, or form. And so there was a 10-point plan, including self determination, like if we want to start our own country, full employment of black people, adequate housing, and finally good education. We're going to fight for that. We're going to, like, if it means killing someone, we will do that because we have been put down for so long. And so, um, after like after a decade or so, this kind of falls out because people start taking the Black Panther movement, and it some people even kind of, it's almost a domestic terrorist group in a way, and people compare it to it's like the Black KKK and not and it's just this fighting point where it's like you have two groups of people fighting against the other race, and so they get compared to the KKK a lot. And then look at the discussion questions for this. Let me get a drink real fast. And then, sadly, we have the assassination of MLK. He is killed in Memphis, Texas, April 4th. So we're coming close to the anniversary of that. So I think Friday, Saturday. Wait, yeah, Friday, Saturday is the anniversary. He was shot standing in a motel balcony. James Earl Ray pleaded guilty, received a 99-year sentence. And then this kind of leaves this vacuum of like who's in charge of the civil rights movement. We don't really have a leader anymore. And so this is kind of the end in some ways of the super organized civil rights movement. And so the Poor People's Campaign, this is kind of a Martin Luther King brainchild. This is a thought for them. And so this is a multiracial army of poor that will come to DC to fight for their rights, to fight for a better life. And so this campaign continued after um, Martin Luther King's assassination. So 7,000 people marched for the Economic Bill of Rights. And sadly, it doesn't pass because the people who are in charge don't view it as a necessity during this time because, again, the Vietnam War is going on, and then also we're worried about more civil rights and not really poor people. And so this leads to the Kerner Commission, which let's look at all of these protests going on. Let's look at civil disorders. It was headed by Otto Kerner. Obviously, it's named after him, the Kerner Commission. And he kind of said it's like looking at America, we're facing an apartheid state in a lot of our major cities where we are seeing mass segregation among our population, not because of laws, but just because of where people are living, which has redlining, which some of it is laws, but um, LBJ rejected the committee's recommendation, and in the later part of LBJ's kind of term, he's worried more about Vietnam than this. So he's fighting this two front war in his mind of Vietnam abroad and then civil rights here, where he's fighting for civil rights, but he has only so much time in the day to concentrate on this front or that front. And so, but luckily, the Civil Rights Act of '68 has passed. Again, Congress stepping up to do this. And this, again, is prohibiting of housing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or sex. And then this is just also a ban on retaliation against asserting rights. So if I'm protesting for my rights, you can't beat me. And so this later it goes into disability and family status as a protected classes. So it like helps single parents, it helps people with disability, it helps a group of people. So civil rights again isn't just a black issue, it's religion. Like if you're a Muslim, or if you're Buddhist or Sikh, or if you're from another country that moved here, or if you're a female, like all of this has stuff taking place. And so this leads to affirmative action. And so this is to increase opportunities in a lot of different industries and a lot of different areas of society for minority groups. And so this favored like women, minorities in just employment and education opportunities. And then sadly, this is usually forced enforced by using quotas. So it's like, okay, like if I'm the University of Stewart and I need to accept 100 people, let's have at least 30 people be of a minority or a disadvantage. And then after that, we don't care. We can add everyone else, but these 30, it doesn't matter as long as they fall into this disadvantaged group. And that was the quota system. And so this led to de facto segregation, which de facto is in fact or in practice, not by law. And so schools were frequently segregated still. And even in today, there are still schools where you have a primarily black school just because of where people live. Not because of laws, but just because of where people are living and just people making their own individual choices as a group. And so this is just like looking at schools and stuff where you see like different groups of people gathering together because it's just how school districts work. And so um, some people mandated forced busing to help desegregate these de facto segregated schools by forced busing. So this was something that was actually in the Democratic um, debates with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, where Kamala Harris accused Joe Biden of not supporting forced busing, as she was someone who was forced bused, and so into a school to separate the segregation. And so even so, forced busing is still a thing today. And so the Swan case in 1971 said that people in Charlotte, South Carolina, could force kids out of a school and improve forced busing and race ratios to achieve integration. So some school districts actually lose a lot of money because they have to bus kids like 30, 40 minutes away, and they're like taking 5 kids and they're taking a big bus like this shown. And it's a weird way to force desegregation or force integration, but it worked a little bit, but it was a weird time. And the thing that happens is Boston and a lot of northern cities hate this and they start violently protesting this because either they don't want their kids to be forced into another school against their will, and or they don't want black kids to come to their white school. All that, like all of the people didn't like this. Then you have the Baquet case, and this was reverse discrimination. And so the University of California at Davis denied a white person admission, even though he scored higher on his medical exams and stuff. And he sued, and he essentially got in, and he said that the court case, the decision written by Powell, Justice Powell, saying that um, affirmative action is constitutional, but how UC Davis did this is wrong, having quotas, racial quotas. And so this is an interesting case, and you'll see college admissions of affirmative action cases coming into play even today, like even in today's time. Like I know maybe 3 or 4 years ago there was a UT case about quotas in UT, University of Texas. And then we have Reverend Jesse Jackson. Reverend Jesse Jackson is actually one of the first major candidates to run for president as a black person. So you have Reverend Jesse Jackson. He has Operation Push and Rainbow, which were to increase ties with the black community in corporations and also to help affirmative action programs get set up for all of these disadvantaged people. And so Jesse Jackson doing this work in the 1970s and the 1980s, and he's still a prominent person today, working for equality for all of these disadvantaged groups, and eventually Push and the Rainbow Coalition merged in '96. And so some of the effects of the civil rights movement, obviously, we have more opportunities for Black people and many minorities. You have more minorities seeking office. You have people being accepting of Black people in the workplace and in society. You have um, you have a problem of total equality not being achieved yet, but the the tracks are being pushed in the right way. And so, also, I think these are our final discussion questions. Make sure you answer these in full and complete sentences, and make sure you have all that. Um, Hopefully, you enjoyed this. Sorry, this is a little longer than usual. I didn't plan on this being longer. That was on me. And also, I'm sorry to get this late to you. My internet was a little wacky yesterday, so I couldn't really record. But yeah, if you have any questions, Google Classroom, message me or email me, okay? Miss you guys, but hopefully this is helpful for you, and hopefully you get this well. Okay, bye.